think back a long time ago, back to May 2015, before the Supreme Court ruling in marriage. So this is a map that tracks LGBT policies and laws. And so this is a map back from May 2015 looking at laws and policies impacting sexual orientation only. We're going to talk about gender identity in a minute. And so at MAP, we track over 30 laws and policies. About half of those impact sexual orientation. And then we look at states and how they fall out in terms of each of these laws and policies. So before the Supreme Court ruling last year, you see this patchwork that existed for laws around sexual orientation specifically. These are laws including access to marriage, parenting rights, non-discrimination laws, laws about safe schools, laws about access to health care. So you see this picture where you've got a bunch of states, mostly on the coasts, that are pretty high in terms of their LGBT or LGB rankings. And then you have this swath sort of through the middle, the South in the middle, with a really negative climate in terms of laws and policies. Now, what did marriage do? Fast forward to currently, right? This is a very different picture. And this really, I think, speaks to the impact of marriage, and that marriage equality in many ways was a cascade, right? It wasn't just can you legally marry someone, but it attached parenting rights. It attached whether you can visit your partner in the hospital, whether you can take family leave, for example. And so this is sort of where we are now in terms of laws and policies specifically about sexual orientation. So we see that there are actually no states in what we call the negative category, but there are 8 states that are still in this low policy tally area. You can see they're in the orange, and then there's a lot of states, right? Half of states, 25 states in this pea green color that are really kind of lacking in, for the most part, non-discrimination laws. They're lacking perhaps some safe schools laws, and they're lacking family leave. Those are, I would say, the big categories, state-level family leave policies. So we have certainly seen an improvement, and I think this is starkly different than a year ago, and I think it is important to honor that as much as we can say marriage did not fix everything. So then the question is, what did marriage do for laws and policies impacting gender identity? Anyone? Absolutely nothing, right? Laws that target people or that address sexual orientation are totally different than laws and policies that are about gender identity. Often they come together, but we at MAP think about them separately and track them separately. So when we look at what the state of the US is for trans people and laws specifically about gender identity, this is what the map looks like today. This is horrific, in my opinion. So you have 12 states in the Washington, D.C. that we put in the high gender identity category, and you have 23 states, nearly half the country, in this negative gender identity category. And what kind of laws and policies are we talking about here? Specifically, we're talking about non-discrimination laws, both employment, housing, public accommodations, schooling, whether non-discrimination laws or bullying laws. We're talking about access to identity documents. Can you update your birth certificate? Can you get an accurate driver's license? Can you get health insurance that will actually cover what you need? Or does your state say, sorry, if you're on Medicaid, we don't cover anything trans-related? This is just sort of a big bucket that we put all these laws into. So this is really important because as much as we saw a huge sea change in terms of access to important protections based on sexual orientation, this is where we are in terms of gender identity. And certainly people have multiple identities, right? So trans people can also be lesbian, gay, bisexual, straight, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, bi people can also be trans. So we're not talking about 2 mutually exclusive categories of people. There are people living both of these experiences. So I want to just dig in a little bit on non-discrimination protections because I think it's going to come up a little bit and give some picture of where we are right now. So currently, we have 20 states and Washington, D.C. that have explicit protections written to state law that prohibit discrimination in employment, in housing, based on sexual orientation and gender identity. Those are the dark green states. And then we have 2 states. This map is just showing employment, but employment and housing are identical. It's when public accommodations, which we are going to talk about, things get a little different. We have 2 states that just cover sexual orientation, and then you have the rest of the country, 28 states, where there are no state-level protections. What's important here, though, is sort of the overlap between federal, state, and local policy. because we have been talking about state level policies which map tracks, but we also look at how do those intersect with federal law. And so federally right now, there is no law that explicitly prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity in employment, housing, or public accommodations. Now, through the EEOC and through other agencies, there is this expanding notion of what is sex discrimination, which is currently prohibited under Title VII and Title IX. And in some cases, the EEOC and other agencies are saying that does include discrimination against transgender people, and in some instances, discrimination based on people based on their sexual orientation. And so Hai Feldblum, who is an EEOC commissioner, speaks very beautifully about that emerging theory. But the EEOC really is just something that courts are supposed to take into consideration. It's not binding on federal courts. And so it has limited impact. We really need federal protections. And then you have states, right? As the map I showed before, we have about 20 states that have passed laws and policies to this degree. And then importantly, we have local cities and counties that are saying, hey, we're in Texas, we're in Utah before Utah passed protections. In Florida, for example, we want to protect the people who live in our cities. And so they are passing ordinances that explicitly prohibit discrimination in these various areas. And in Florida, for example, more than 50% of people living in Florida live in a city or county with these protections. So this is not nothing, and it's important. So you sort of have these concentric circles and how they fit together. One thing that I wanted to mention, because I think we are going to talk a little bit about it, is the tensions that are happening at these various levels. So in North Carolina, for example, you had a local ordinance that was passed that we were really excited about, and they had the state kind of come in and say, no, can't do that, and passed a law that now handcuffs cities' abilities to pass ordinances, both on sexual orientation and gender identity and on paid maternity leave or minimum wage laws or plastic bag bans or anything like that. And so these all fit together, and I think that's really important to point out. So this is sort of where we are when you look at sexual orientation and gender identity together, right? So the trans component here, really, you see that overlaid in terms of where we are in terms of states. So we have a couple states in the negative tally, Tennessee and Alabama. Then you have a large swath of states that are in this low tally, and 14 states that are in this high policy tally. And then quickly, because I think that what is so important when we talk about the legal issues is who is the LGBT community. It's one thing to have this idea of who we are and try to legislate or pass policies that help us or hurt us. But if you actually think about who we are and what our needs are, I think that can really drive things. So the LGBT community is incredibly racially and ethnically diverse. 1 in 3 LGBT people in a Gallup survey identified as a person of color. And when you look at what percent of Americans identify as LGBT, it's 3.4% in this survey. But when you look at folks of color, 4.6% of African Americans, 4.3% of Asians, and 4% of Hispanics. So higher rates in communities of color. We also see that childbearing rates are much higher among LGBT people of color and people of color in same-sex couples. Upwards of 40%, for example, of African American women in same-sex couples living in poverty. And the stats, this is also from Gallup. Folks with kids, it's a huge issue. You see that married or partnered LGBT people with kids are twice as likely to have incomes near the poverty level. And we can talk about why, I think, during some of this, when we talk about the impact of laws and policies on people's lives. The last thing I want to leave with is some emerging research, which echoes much of what we in the LGBT community already knew, but that is that LGBT people are more likely to be involved in systems, whether it's the child welfare system, whether it's the criminal justice system. So you see here that LGBT people on the left, that's the charts on the left, we're about twice the rate in jails and prisons than we are in the rest of the community. 7.9% of people in a federal survey, this is important, a federal survey, identified as LGB in America's jails and prisons. And then this study on the right is just incredibly shocking to me. So this is of 7 juvenile justice facilities, what percent of kids in those facilities identify as LGBT or gender nonconforming? And you see that 40% of girls, right? 20% of all youth, 14% of boys. And we think LGBT kids make up about 7 to 9% of the youth population. So this is 4 times the rate. So clearly there's something going on that we And we're trying to unpack this, and I think Tyrone can talk about this and others. But I think that these are just some important issues as we talk about some of the legal issues that impact the LGBT community. So I think with that, I'll
Okay, great.
stop.